Okay, we can begin the session.
Hi everyone, welcome, bienvenue. My name is Arko Datto and I am a visual artist and curator. And as part of a series of virtual engagements with French and Indian artists, curators, heads of museums, and galleries between Chennai Photo Biennale and the French Institute in India, today I will be hosting a conversation with Quentin Bajac, who is the director of the Galerie Nationale de Jeu de Paume, and we will be discussing his curatorial projects and discussing the institution that he is part of. So welcome, I would extend a very warm welcome to him, and thank you so much, Quentin, for being with us. And welcome once again everyone who's part of this discussion, this conversation today. I will give you a brief introduction to Quentin. He's a French curator and an art historian, and he specializes in the history of photography. He has previously held positions at some of my favorite institutions. So he started after gaining his diploma from the Institut National du Patrimoine. He was appointed the curator of photography at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and from there he moved on to Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, and then from there he went to the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, and recently he has come back to Paris, and he is the director of the Galerie Nationale de Jeu de Paume in Paris. He has published a number of works on photography, most notably the three-volume series La Photographie on the history of photography, belonging to the Collection Découverte Gaimard, as well as Par by Par, discussions with the promiscuous photographer, a book on Stephen Shore, Solving Pictures, and Being Modern MoMA in Paris, amongst a lot of other great works. He has also been made a Chevalier Knight of the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. So thank you so much for joining us, and I will invite you to present, share some of your works and the institution that you're working in currently right now, the Jeu de Paume, to speak about and present a bit of your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arko, for this invitation, and thank you to the Chennai Photo Biennale. Yeah, good morning. It's 11. I say good morning because it's 11:30 for me, a local time in Paris, and I'm talking to you from an empty Jeu de Paume. Empty because even if the lockdown in Paris is behind us, and even if most of the cultural institutions are slowly reopening again, we Jeu de Paume are still closed because we are under renovation. So there's construction work here at the Jeu de Paume, and unfortunately, Jeu de Paume is going to stay closed for a few months, probably a little more than we initially expected, but probably we will only be able to reopen early spring 2021, that is in March or next April, with an exhibition that I will present to you. So first, let me try to share my screen. We did try to share the screen first, and it worked, so I hope that it still works, and give you a short introduction about what the Jeu de Paume is and what are our main activities. So, does that still work?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Jeu de Paume. So I started at Jeu de Paume, as Arko was saying, as a director 15 months ago. So it's still rather new. And in fact, most of the exhibitions that have taken place here in the last 15 months were decided by my predecessor. So what I would call my program will only start in 2021 when we reopen after the renovation work. But I still wanted, of course, to say a few words about that institution. First, you see on the right of the screen the building, which is located in the center of Paris, as probably a lot of you know, and probably some of you have already been to Jeu de Paume. So in the Tuileries Garden, that is not far facing the Place de la Concorde and not far from the Louvre Museum. So in a very historical and classic neighborhood, and it is that building that was designed and constructed in the second half of the 19th century as a Jeu de Paume, which is the ancestor of the tennis court. So these were in fact initially tennis courts for 50 years at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And it is only in the early 20s, that is after First World War, that that building was turned into a museum. And in fact, what is interesting to say is that it was probably one of the first building that was not designed as a museum to be turned into a museum. Now we know that a lot, from Tate Modern to other building, but that was quite unusual at that time in the early 20th century. Then it remained for, let's say, 60 to 70 years, a building that was devoted to exhibitions of mostly contemporary paintings. And then, from the 50s onwards to the Impressionists. For 40 years, the National Collection of Impressionism were exhibited here. And then from the early 90s, it was redesigned. That very, as you see on the left of my screen, that it was redesigned in a very contemporary way by an architect whose name is Stinko, to house exhibitions of contemporary art. I insist on the fact that this is only what in Germany you call the Kunsthalle, so a space for exhibition. We have no collection. And it was so from the early 90s designed to house exhibition about contemporary art. And from 2004, that is 16 years ago, it was said that it would be strictly devoted to the image, to the mechanical image. So that is photography, but also video, film, etc., etc., etc. With all the maybe we will talk about that. With all the ever-changing definition of mechanical and electronic imagery. So we have approximately, let me think in square feet, we have approximately 15,000 square feet of exhibition space on two levels. And we try to organize between 6 to 8 shows a year, depending on their size, with always a balance between contemporary projects and historical ones. My predecessor, Marta Gilly, who ran that institution for approximately 12 years, always decided to do monographic shows, that is only focusing on monographic exhibitions. And I would like in the future to do more thematic shows than she used to do. But for, let's say, 12 to 15 years, the program was a lot about monographs. Let me try to see if that's. So you see here the main hall of the building, with that great view over the Tuileries Garden, with the obelisk of the Place de la Concorde, and then, of course, as you see on the far left, the Eiffel Tower that you see almost from my office, which is very close to that. So rather, as you see, a nice neighborhood, a nice setting, nice and rather spacious and with a lot of light entering that main hall. So we have not only exhibitions, but we also have quite important program of cultural events and film programs especially, but also, you know, symposiums, etc. in a small auditorium of approximately 100 seats that we have in the basement of of the building. We have approximately, that maybe that won't maybe sound a lot to you in India, but we have approximately 250,000 visitors a year, which is not that bad. And we have an increasingly, I would say, large and varied audience each year. And I would also add that most of our exhibition travel abroad, around the world, and that it is also a way for us, of course, to attract a bigger audience. I will then add to that presentation that we have another small building, which is located 200 kilometers south of Paris in the historical city of Tours, where we organize exhibitions that are more focused on historical projects or historical monographs. So two places. We also have a bookshop, and I really insist on that because I think it's an important place in Paris. We have a small, but I would say very good bookshop, which is of course also focused on photography and the moving image and the lens-based, even if they're not lens-based anymore, lens-based / mechanical arts and images. We also have worked a lot to develop our internet presence, our presence on the web in the last, let's say, 10 years, since 2007. We have a magazine online with a lot of new editorial content, essays and portfolios, and also website that has some creation online, a real virtual space with a program of special web-based projects and thematic shows, which is in fact entrusted to curators specializing in digital art. So there's always a new work which is put online every 3 months. And right now, if you check our website, you will see that there's a new work by the Berlin-based artist Evan Roth, which is called Since You Were Quarantined, which has been so recently put online, and in which Evan recycles all the images which are in his computer, and that were kept in his computer during the lockdown from end of March to early May in Berlin. But we try to have every 3 months a new work that we commission. So, and then we have, as I was saying, approximately 6 to 8 exhibitions a year. And just very quickly, I will go through a few works of the more recent exhibition that we have had, and that unfortunately, of course, was closed in a very abrupt way mid-March, and that we didn't reopen, and that which is now in Crete, but that we hope will travel, that should travel hopefully in China and Taiwan in the spring of 2021, which is called the Supermarket of Images, and which is about the economy of images today, how images are being produced, exchanged, stored, etc., etc. So it's a rather big thematic shows, including works, mostly contemporary works by approximately 60 artists, a very international panel. And I will just go quickly through a few of the works that were exhibited. You see here you saw here that big Andreas Gursky image about which shows an Amazon warehouse, even if, as often with Andreas Gursky, it is a composite image made of a lot of different shots that he constructed and assembled. You have here that wonderful work by Ana Vitória Mussi, who is a Brazilian artist and who did that waterfall of gelatin silver prints, very poetic and very sculptural, from in fact a lot of images that she herself took when she was a photojournalist for several Brazilian newspapers in the late 70s and early 80s. so reworking from her own material. And then who else? Very quickly, Jeff Guess, who is that American artist based in Paris. So a video slash computer work. Thomas Roof, so works that you probably know from the early 2000s and from that Substrat series that deals with the materiality and even the materiality of software computer images, and also a lot of video and sometimes interactive works. And here just one example of that wonderful Ito Steyer, the German artist, installation, which is about duty-free art, which is about the free ports and the way images and artworks are stored in these free ports, unseen and never seen by anyone. Or some more historical works, because we also wanted to have a kind of historical context to that exhibition, to show that kind of overwhelming flow of images was not something new. That was something that in a way maybe appeared in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with that great Martha Rosler cargo cult photomontage of the late 60s, early 70s. So that's the kind of thematic show that I would like to do more in the future, dealing and addressing contemporary issues. Even if in the future, when we reopen, the first exhibition we will reopen with will be that one, will be a retrospective of that great German photographer whose name is Michael Schmidt. That probably a lot of you know. Michael Schmidt was born in the just after Second World War in 1945, and what is amazing is that even if he's a very influential figure in German and European photography, and even his work has been closely looked at by a lot of people from very different backgrounds, his work was never shown in France, where we have a vision of, I would say, post-war German photography that is very influenced by the Dusseldorf school. But there are other traditions and other sensibilities in German photography from the 60s, 70s, and Michael Schmidt, who was based in Berlin and who in fact never moved from Berlin, is probably one of the most interesting ones. So it will be a full retrospective. When I mean a full retrospective, it will take the 2 floors of the Jeu de Paume, and it's curated by one of the great specialists of Michael Schmidt, whose name is Thomas Wesky, who runs the Michael Schmidt archive in Berlin, and it's co-organized with Berlin, with the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, with the Reina Sofia in Madrid, and the Albertina in Vienna, because as you know, exhibitions are getting more and more expensive, and it's more and more important for us each year to co-produce show. It's getting more and more difficult to do one show, even especially of that ambition, only by ourselves. So Michael Schmidt, that will reopen the building, the renovated building, in the spring 2021, even if the dates that we indicate are not absolutely fixed ones. And then, as I was saying, I want to have a mix of contemporary, and I still call Michael Schmidt contemporary, even if he died 6 years ago. He should have been, in a way, 71 or 72. So he's definitely a contemporary photographer. And so a balance or a mix of contemporary and more historical shows. And in the fall 2021, so we'll have coming from MoMA, which is normal, because I still have connections with MoMA, a selection of approximately 300 works from the modern era, especially from the 20s, 30s, and early 40s, mostly European and American. Coming from a great private collection that MoMA bought 20 years ago in 2000 from the German slash Swiss collector Thomas Walter. So it's an amazing collection with a lot of iconic works from that period, from Alvin London Coburn to Burckhardt to Lisitsky, etc., to Rodchenko, Weston. So it will be for the French and European audience a way to to discover this collection that has never been shown outside the US, and in fact outside MoMA. MoMA showed it in 2014 when I was at the head of the photo department, but it hasn't been shown yet since. And in fact, we are adding new images that MoMA bought from Thomas Walter more recently in 2018. So it will be a completely new and remixed and revised exhibition from that collection that will also probably take place on the 2 floors, because maybe we'll have the opportunity to talk about that with after my small presentation. But we are trying to find ways to have more spacious exhibition layout because of the pandemic, and we're thinking about having less shows and more spacious shows in order to unfortunately abide to these new sanitary rules. And then in the early 2022, an exhibition that is very important for me, and in fact initially I wanted to reopen the new building in 2021 with that one, but it was not possible, which is what we call a festival, but which is a kind of biennale, even if I don't want to use the term biennale, because I have the feeling that every institution today has a biennale, and it shouldn't be a biennale, but it should be an event that comes back at an uneven rhythm from time to time. But that will be something, so an exhibition devoted to emerging artists and in all medias, from photography to video to electronic arts, etc. Something that I definitely should not curate. I will invite curators from outside, and in fact, for that first edition in 2022, I decided to invite a French curator who lives between Paris and New York, whose name is Béatrice Gross, and also to have, in fact, a duo of one curator and one artist, because I thought that was interesting. And so we have Beatrice Gross working with a German sculptor whose name is Katinka Bock, who lives between Berlin and Paris, most in Paris, but also in Berlin, who is not a photographer, but who is definitely very interested in photography and who has used photography in her sculptural work. And that's a rule that I want to stick to in the future, to have that kind of duo of one curator and one artist, because I think that creates some interesting dialogues and an interesting dynamic. So this first, I would say, festival will take place early 2022, and once again in the whole building. So there will be photos, video, films, for probably performance, etc. Because and a very strong cultural season that will accompany that show. So if you're in Paris in the spring 2022, please do come to discover this new emerging artist. Do I have something else in my PowerPoint? Let me check. No, I think that was the end. So thank you, and maybe we can discuss. We'll stop the share screen and we can start our discussion, Arko, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. And I would just want to say that we have 35 more minutes of discussion, and then we will be having a half an hour of question and answers. So all our attendees, whoever's in the listening to this, you're more than welcome to share your questions with us. You can type them in the comment section below, and we will take them as in when you have, after our discussion. Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, I think thank you so much for your presentation, Quentin. One thing that kind of struck me with our date today, the 7th, is that yesterday was also the Louvre, which opened after the lockdown. So you're in the place where the Louvre has opened yesterday. So all these images started coming out, and you mentioned, which was also a very strong image of you being the only one at the Jeu de Paume right now at the institution, which is still in lockdown and renovation process. So there was a very evocative image there. There was a photographer yesterday, a photojournalist who lives in Paris, who shared an image on Facebook of this couple who had traveled all the way from the Czech Republic to be there in Paris at the Louvre for the first day of opening. So for them, it was a historical moment. And I think it was very evocative in the way the image was very simple, this couple wearing masks in front of the Mona Lisa. So in that sense, it was in terms of imagery, it was a fairly cliched pandemic image, a cliched image in the pandemic time. But it got me thinking about the idea of the role of art, the role of museums, and the role of curators in the post-pandemic world, in which France is emerging right now. Of course, India is a bit lagging on that front right now, but as you were saying, that France is, it's opening up, and the museums are back in space. The institutions are sort of coming back, finding their footing. So, what do you envisage would be the role of art, museums, and the role of the curator in this emerging post-pandemic world? If we could have your thoughts on that.
That's a very big question. First, what I will try to answer first by saying that we did try to be present during the pandemic and during the lockdown through a lot of digital events, videos that we put online, etc., through social media, but also on our website. So we did try to imagine and create new ways of addressing our audience during the lockdown. Not that new, in fact, because it's very difficult to invent a new form, but we did try to be more present on social media and on the website through different events and contents. For example, I decided from the first day of the lockdown to do a very to post every day a very short text about one of the books from my library, from that I had on my bookshelves in my apartment in Paris, that was dealing with photography or video or film or art, and that was for me a way to remain present, to stay alive, to stay, and also, of course, to address to talk to our audience and to tell them in a way that even if we're all on our own, we were all together. So there was that idea of trying to rebuild a community that was for us very important. Now it's true, as you were mentioning, so institutions are very slowly reopening. And I have mixed feelings about the Jeu de Paume not reopening right now. Mixed feelings because, of course, we would love to be part of that reopening because we can feel a kind of excitement at these places reopening. But on the other hand, I also see the difficulties of that exercise. Some institutions have reopened in Paris already 3 to 4 weeks ago. And it seems that the public is very slow to come back. So as if, there was still that kind of anxiety and as if, that kind of period of 2 months and a half at home had still some impact on the minds and on the bodies. So people are very slowly coming back to all these museums and cultural institutions. But it's true that we have a role to play. We have a cultural role, and we also have in France an economic role, because as you know, a lot of tourism is an important part of the economic activity in France, especially at that season in July and August. And tourism relies a lot on the cultural institution, especially on the museum, from the Louvre to Versailles to Orsay to the Centre Pompidou. Here at the Jeu de Paume, we're less into this mass tourism, but that's also a role that cultural institutions have to play. But of course, here there's a social role, there's a cultural role, and there's also the need to, I would say, go on with the exhibition project that we had, but also trying to take into account the fact that something happened and that you cannot do as if nothing had happened, that something happened, that people maybe have new desires, new anxieties, new interests, and in cultural and political terms, there was 10 days ago in France, a big election in all the city councils. And what you see from the result of this election is that there's a strong feeling of environmental needs and all these environmental issues that now resurface in a very strong way, and in a way we should also take that into account, and we should feel that shift and that changes of sensibilities. And in a more practical way, it's true that it's going to affect all the way we present the artworks, in all our exhibitions. We decided in the future in 2021, because I'm afraid that the pandemic will not be completely behind us in 2021, to have less exhibitions than we would have had, in order to have more space, in order to have a layout that will leave more space between the works, in order also to have circuits and circulation that is sometimes difficult in a rather small building as Jeu de Paume is. So that will definitely have an effect not only on the way people come and go to our institution, but on the way they behave in the building, and of course on the way we should present and artworks.
I think, thank you so much. I think on that note, what I was also thinking is that the idea of time has kind of undergone a very a rapid acceleration in a sense. Like with the pandemic, the world has suddenly started moving. Of course, there is a lockdown, so there is a sense of slowing down. But on another level, like we are every day is presenting new tragedies in a sense, So there is new news. The pandemic is moving in a different way. So we are also caught up in this sort of ennui of having to cope with new shocks every day. So we have climate change, which is, and it's also in a sense strongly related and tied to the pandemic. And so these environmental concerns are kind of becoming very prescient, very strong, very, very immediate in a way, right? Yeah. And I think for the first time, the pandemic has become like the first truly global event. In a sense, I'm like pretty much anywhere in the world, people can get together with other people. Of course, there is a language barrier, but theoretically, people can share or speak of a shared experience. So in that sense, in the times that we live in, it's perhaps the first the truly broad event, truly global event that kind of sets or puts everyone on a similar platform. Of course, economic disparity treats different people, affects them in different ways. The pandemic affects people from different backgrounds in different ways. But I was wondering in terms of like also how with this rapid, at the same time, acceleration and deceleration of time, and the way that we are experiencing time, and also the fact that there is this global event which is touching all of us, maybe that also has a bearing on the way curation and museums would sort of have to, adjust or accommodate to these changes. Yeah, it was more of it's a thought on, I mean, just gathering thoughts on where things are headed. But if you want to add anything to that note.
No, I don't think, that there's always a question about should we should we address these issues, or should we distract people from these issues? You know, because also I have the feeling that a lot of people don't want to also to have to deal with these issues anymore. They will have to, but so there's once again, as I was talking about, mixed feelings about that crisis. Some want to address these issues, some want to try to do as if these issues were behind them, which is definitely not the case, unfortunately. So there's a balance to keep. I don't see myself, you know, organizing, if we were to reopen 10 exhibitions around environmental issues and pandemic, because that would be absolutely repetitive, etc. So there's a way to address these issues in a soft and, I would say, cultural way, which needs to be be found in order not to be too repetitive.
You spoke about the great exhibition that was there at Jeu de Paume just before the lockdown happened. That was the La Supermarché des Images, the supermarket of images, which was I had the fortune of being able to visit that before it shut down. So, and I mean, it was a pretty amazing exhibition. It had a lot of my favorite artists like Hito Stoll, whose work you show, Trevor Paglin, and you know. So I was wondering, in terms of you mentioned also in the write-up for that exhibition that like the world is inundated with 3 billion images or more every day on social media. I guess now even more, because people sharing images is kind of one of the only things that people are doing stuck at home. So like in this world of an inordinate, let's say, a cornucopia of images that we are faced with, what's the role of a curator of images, a visual culture of photography in that sort of domain, in that barrage of images? How do you make sense of that information? Yeah.
My first answer would be that I'm older than you are. So I have, in a way, a kind of maybe historical perspective, you know, from my own point of view. And I would like to start with that, because I have the feeling, you know, that when I started, you know, studying history of art, and especially studying history of photography, that was in the mid-late 80s, early 90s, the access to photographic images was sometimes difficult. The history of photography was still what I would call a new science. Some photographers that are today very well known were almost unknown 20 or 30 years ago. And so just do the experience of opening any history of photography written before the early 90s, you will not find any mention of India, of Africa, of countries outside the Western world and the Western Hemisphere. And if you have a look right now, just see how many books today have been written on African photography in the last 20 years. So I think that for the former generation, what I want to say by that is that for the former generations, let's say, the problem was to have access to the images, because there were in fact too few images that were available. And I would say that today, let's say since the internet and since the late 90s, early 2000, I would say that we have too easy access to too many images. You were talking about the overflow of images. I'm talking about Siegfried Krakauer blizzard of images, which is the expression that he used in the mid-20s to describe the situation that he had the feeling that they were already experiencing at that time. So it's interesting to see that each generation seems to have that idea that throughout the 20th century that they're confronting, or that they have to experience that overflow of images. But yeah, there was today, because of the multiplication of actors, because of an easier and faster circulation, we are confronted to that overflow. And of course, my feeling is that in that new ocean of images, to quote the title of a show that we organized at MoMA in 2015, we have to help people not to get drowned. to swim, and to swim by educating the eye. So I think it's important to give key example, to give historical backgrounds, which I think also it's in the tradition of each institution, that educational mission, which is very important for us, Jeu de Paume. And this overwhelming presence of images is something that that we need to address, and this is why I think, especially today, cultural institutions have to have that idea that they need to be that place of connoisseurship and advice. I don't know if I did answer your question, but I think that's something that is really important for me, because I really have the feeling that in the last 30 years that situation has evolved a lot, and that when I go back to my early days of curator in the late 80s, early 90s, let's say early 90s, in my field, that was a history of photography. You could have 300 key books that would be on 10 shelves. Today, it's a far bigger literature that you have to master and control, and it's getting more and more difficult, for cultural institutions to, in a way, to compete with other media, with social media that have a far greater strength and power than we do. I think that, of course, how Jeu de Paume can compete with Instagram, how Jeu de Paume with its 250,000 visitors a year can compete with his Instagram and his billions and its billions of people online every day. It's something difficult, but we need to give what I would say that historical, that contextualization, and that quality and of debate, of discourse, of explanation, and that means education, that other networks that do not give. So this is why, it brings on the even more than before our educational mission at the forefront.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the points that you mentioned was the access to a lot of the photography from, as you mentioned right now, from across the world. So you may like from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and do you think there is adequate representation of work from these regions already in European/French institutions, or could there be a better representation if possible?
It is improving, but there could be, and there should be, of course, a better representation. I think that we're going in the right direction, but we're going quite slowly in the right direction, probably more slowly than some other countries. I have the feeling that, in a way, coming from the US, that the US are far more advanced in that opening toward the non-Western culture than France is, because maybe because of its kind of colonial past, has sometimes some problems, opening to some areas, especially Africa. We should have that very profound and direct dialogue with Africa, but which is always a biased dialogue because of historical issues. But things are slowly going in the right direction, moving away from the canon. And I completely include myself in this. You mentioned the fact that I had written a small history of photography in 3 volumes, which in fact I published
between 2003 to 2000 and 2010, so over a period of 10 years, from so early 19th century to today. So the last volume was published 10 years ago. If I were to do it again, I would do it completely differently. It's still, when I look at it, I'm a little ashamed. It's so Western centric, with only a few, allusions to Japan, to the Middle East, but always in its connection with the Western world. That it's definitely not a comprehensive history of photography. And when I arrived at that MoMA, and when I took over the head of the photo department in 2012, I was, very clear with what I wanted to say, because there was, that idea that MoMA was always the judgment seat of photography, and that MoMA had written the history of photography. Right from the beginning, I said, we're not writing the history of photography. We're writing a history of photography, which is a history of photography seen from a Western perspective, and to be more precise, from an American perspective and from an East Coast perspective that would be different from the West Coast perspective. And that we should be very clear about that in order not to look to authoritarian or to imperialist in the way we tell the history of. So the context has changed, and I said from the start that MoMA could not pretend to be writing the history of photography, but should be far more cautious and should be open to other narratives and to other institutions and to other ways, and to write that history of photography. So I would say that each institution is not writing the ultimate narrative, but a narrative that is one possible narrative among other possible narratives. I was in India, a few months ago. I was in Delhi and I gave a lecture, on which was around, I would say, stage photography. And most of the examples I gave were Western ones. I talked about Brassai, about Douaneau, French photography, but also about Sheffield. And then one guy in the audience told me, but you look very, this is very the narrative of the old Western white guy, very in that canonical history of photography. And my answer was that that's what I'm a specialist of, and I would not pretend to talk about Indian photography that I don't know well in India. I know when I talk from France and the Western world, on photographer that I studied and worked on very closely. And this is my history, this is our history, but I never pretended that was the ultimate and the ultimate narrative. It is one narrative among others. Mm-hmm.
I'll take it. We have 10 more, roughly 12 more minutes of our discussion, and then we once again welcome the attendees to send us your questions. We'd be very happy to.
Arko, to extend on that, that idea of globalization and of a narrative that would be more encompassing, that would be more global, is something that has been discussed for almost the last 40 years. I'm thinking of an issue of Art Forum, Art in America in the late 80s, which was the global issues, and that was during the exhibition Magicien de la Terre, which took place at the Centre Pompidou in 89. And all the issue was about, the turning point in the acceptance of global art and the end of a Western perspective. That was what, 40 years ago. Things have changed, but things are changing slowly.
Well, let's hope it accelerates fast in the coming days, at least. So I wanted to go to some other points that we could talk about. One is the centrality of books in your practice. You are an art historian and a curator, so you work a lot with creating books which accompany the exhibitions, but also otherwise. So it would be nice to hear your thoughts on the centrality of the book in your professional Discourse.
Yeah. Yeah, and once again, I will maybe try to take a historical perspective, because once again, so having starting to curate in the early 90s, I see a lot of difference from yesterday to today. I have the feeling that, when I started in the 90s with working with contemporary photographers, all were, I would say, wall-oriented. Or they all had their art at that for-the-wallness quality. The idea that they were creating for the galleries, for the museum in that vertical aspect. And very few, in fact, were really interested in book forms, I'm especially thinking about, the Düsseldorf School, the Düsseldorf School of Photographers. If you have a look at them and what they produced in the 90s, they were really interested in the exhibition form, in the physical presence of the object, and far, far less in books. And that has changed a lot with the internet and with the social media and with the possibility to do books on your own, print-on-demand books from 2000, and then self-published books, etc. So it's true that today you have not only artists that are once again creating and thinking in terms of books, but also books, as has become a market. Which is also very important. And I think that especially the book published by Martin Parr and Jerry Badger in 3 volumes from 2005 or something like that was very influential, and it really created a market. It not only created an interest around the book form, but it also created a market, and sometimes the two go together. Yeah. So it's true that today you have a lot of artists that are thinking in terms of books, not only exhibition, but also of books. And of course, the museum has to adjust and to adapt to that new deal and to that evolution, which is not always easy, because it's showing a book in the exhibition is sometimes a little difficult. Either you show it in a showcase, in a vitrine, but then you cannot go through it, or you show it on a screen, but then you lack the materiality of the book. So it's always difficult. But that was one point. But yeah, I did also always try to work with books and with different books. Most of the books I worked with were exhibition catalogs, which is also something different. And I was always interested, when I do exhibition catalogs, to try to do catalogs that are real books. I mean, that can stand on their own apart from the exhibition, that are not complementary to the exhibition, but that I hope, can be read 15, 20, 25 years after the exhibition, which is something that I've always favored and try to achieve. And then I did try that exercise of writing a whole history of photography, which was a very interesting exercise, but I'm not sure that I would do it again today, for some of the reasons that I was mentioning earlier, because maybe it's getting more and more difficult to say that you can write a comprehensive history of photography, that you can write the ultimate history of photography, or I would try to write it in another way. And then, there's another aspect that I'm really interested in, and that I'm more and more interested in today, are interviews and, dialogues and talks with artists. I have the feeling that maybe what is the more important for us today, as curators and historians of photography, is to put artists at the forefront and to do interviews with them, to have their voices and to keep their voices and to transmit their voices. So this is why, in fact, I did that book with Martin Parr, and I would like in the future to do that exercise again with other. And I did also quite a number of interviews with younger French artists and photographers. So that's an exercise that I'm interested in, and that I think in the future, when you have a look at, when I see today the books I'm using as a curator and as an historian, I often find the texts that have been written, even by very good historians, let's be 60 or 50 years ago, a bit old-fashioned, a bit outmoded, a bit dated, but I still, I'm interested in the interviews they did with artists. So I think in a way, it's maybe what will survive. And, it's in a very modest way, maybe more than the text that we write, the interviews and the talks that we have with artists will survive and will be of interest for the future generations.
You mentioned some time back that you're also looking forward to having the possibility of doing more thematic exhibitions. And while there is the work with Parr or Stephen Shore, which are more monographic in their approach. So I was wondering, in terms of a curatorial perspective, developing a curatorial, how according to you is like the monograph in relation to the thematic? What kind of envisioning, in terms of envisioning the curatorial, what kind of challenges or differences or change of perspective do you face?
Well, I think that these are two different exercises, and these are two difficult exercises, but for different reasons. So to start with thematic exhibition, I think that the main issue, well, when you're facing with a thematic show, is that when you do a thematic show, you want generally to express an idea, to address an issue, you have a concern, to tell a story, but you need at the same time to bear in mind that within that kind of montage, because like the exhibition is always a montage, in a way, kind of cinematographic montage, you have the artist voices. When you have 60 artists, like in Supermarket of the Images that I did not curate, and that these artist voices will sometimes be slightly dissonant with what you aim at showing and with what you aim at telling. What I mean by that is that it's important to keep that balance, to pursue your idea, but you also to allow each photographer to preserve his or her individuality, those kind of specific features that they have. So let the images speak for themselves, let the work speaks for themselves, even if sometimes they do not align precisely with your discourse, with your curatorial discourse. And that's in fact what is important in a thematic show. And this is always something that is difficult to find. I sometimes find some thematic shows, including some that I curated, when I look back at them, too illustrative in a way. They try, to frame each work, whereas you have to let the work express itself and sometimes go in a direction that is not your main direction, but that can, of course, give a different perspective on the topic. Then you have, there's a world of difference between organizing a historical exhibition when you deal with estates and none of the artist is living, and working with living photographer, which is very different perspective. And when you work with a living photographer, and I work with some, you mentioned Stephen Shore, I worked with William Klein, with Bernard Villa-Becher, with Martin Parr, even if I never curated a show with Martin Parr. So people from very different backgrounds and with very different sensitivities. What is always, there's one common denominator with all these living artists is that usually when you're a curator and when you talk with these people that are, let's say, in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, that have a work behind them, you want to show their work in a historical perspective, and they're far always more interested in the present time. So there's always that balance to find. And I have worked with, as I was saying, many different photographers or artists, and many different in their style, in their approach. but I still find, that common denominator, that they are less interested in their past achievements. They're always a little afraid of talking about a retrospective, a survey show, and they're really in the moment in 2020, and that's always the tricky part of the exhibition, to find the proper balance between historicizing their work and yet showing the dynamic of their work today, which I perfectly understand, but which is sometimes a little difficult to achieve. Yeah.
I think so. We are almost done with our part of the discussion. We will be taking questions very soon. So you're more than welcome to type in your questions to us. I would like to end before we go on to the questions. I was very intrigued by this one exhibition that you had done, which is on Victor Hugo. So I just wanted you to briefly talk to us a bit about that. Victor Hugo is known as, he's very popular, very famous in India with the ardent readers as a writer, and you had created a photographic exhibition based on his exile. So I think it would be nice to hear a bit about that. I found that exhibition very intriguing, so it would be nice to hear about.
Yeah, you mentioned that exhibition to me earlier, an exhibition I wouldn't say that I had almost forgotten, but that dates back from the mid-90s when I was a young curator at the Musée d'Orsay. And that's probably one of the first exhibitions that I co-curated with one of my colleagues from the Musée d'Orsay, and which was an interesting topic because, yeah, that was about a writer and his use of photography during the period he was in exile. So Victor Hugo was in exile away from France during almost 20 years, in fact. He was in Jersey and Guernsey, that is in the Channel Islands, that are what, 40 away from the Brittany coast. And he stayed there with all his family, with his sons, with his daughter, with his brother, many people that came to visit him. And he was at that time interested in photography, and he thought that at that time he could earn his living for photography and maybe produce some works, including works of his poems that would be illustrated with photographs. He was not a photographer himself, but he was really interested in the way that mechanical image could be used as a democratic weapon, to reproduce his image, to send his image across the channel, and to show that he was still alive, and that he was still alive and fighting the power of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in France at that time. So there was that idea. In fact, they did a lot of they had important photographic activities in the early 50s, mostly in the early 50s. So his two sons and the husband of his wife, the husband of his daughter, were in fact the photographers. Victor Hugo was not taking the photos himself, but they did a lot of portraits of people, of Victor Hugo, of other people, of landscapes of the islands, and they would cut them and paste them into books, especially Victor Hugo books or books of poems by Victor Hugo that they would send abroad to people that they knew. So we had done a very nice small show and a rather impressive catalogue raisonné of that work. And in fact, that is for me one of the first real encounters of a writer and the photographic image. And that's also very interesting because, as you know, there's, after Victor Hugo, a long tradition of writers being interested in photography, and then writers using photography, and writers being also themselves photographers.
Thank you so much. Well, on that note, I think it was very interesting. It sits kind of between that monographic and thematic because he's working with his son. So it had that sort of in-between beautiful.
And it also raises interesting questions of authorship, You know, who is the author
exactly.
of the image? Is he?
Yeah.
Is it the model? Is it the presence of Victor Hugo, who was, of course, very, very influential on his sons? Is he? Because in fact, is he the author? Is he? So then that was raising some interesting issues, yes, of authorship and of what is doing an image, making an image.
Well, thank you so much. I think on that note, we can stop our part of the discussion and go on to some of the questions that are here. We invite the others who are the attendees to share with us your questions. So we'll take a couple of the ones that are here. This is from Karan Kaul, and he has two questions. So I'll take the first one. It's pertaining to the Jeu de Paume, and this is something I was thinking about before. Also, the Jeu de Paume went from being a sporting arena for tennis to becoming a museum, and then during the Second World War, it was also used as a sorting house for a clearing house for of looted art by the Nazis, and from that it became this amazing museum of contemporary art, you know, and doing such great shows right now. So there's a very nice trajectory. There's a very interesting trajectory to the Jeu de Paume. So Karan's question here is, what were the architectural and conceptual challenges of reconstructing the Jeu de Paume from the insides? So,
well, I was not here at that time. You know, it was in the early 90s. But in fact, one of the main issue with the building of the Jeu de Paume is that it's very long but rather narrow, which is how, you know, the Jeu de Paume fields were, the courts were, so which is sometimes a little difficult. And one of the other issues is that the Jeu de Paume was when it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. You know, when it was made to house painting, and especially historical paintings, there was natural light and there was natural ceiling, natural light coming from the ceiling, and of course that had to be completely darkened and put into when it was turned into a space for photography. So there was that problematic of, you know, trying to build a space that was initially, you know, designed to be lit by natural light, and to turn it into a camera obscura, almost the dark space with no natural light, and yet to make it still pleasant for the visitor. So that was in fact the main issue, to turn that exhibit to turn that space, which was, you know, in the middle of the Tuileries Gardens, on the gardens, meant to be seen from outside, and where visitors were supposed to be able to look from the window to the garden, to make it into a far more, I would say, reflexive, and dark space. So that was the main challenge. But it's a wonderful space. But we always would love to have a little more square footage or square feet. We have a very tiny cafe. We have a rather small bookshop. And ideally, but that's probably what all the directors of each institution say, but we would love to have a few more square feet, but unfortunately we cannot extend anywhere into the Tuileries Gardens.
There is another question from Karan. What kind of collaborations does the museum realize with artists and curators from the French colonies, such as Algeria? And what have been the interesting outcomes of it, in your opinion?
And what have been, sorry, the interesting outcomes of?
What have been the interesting outcomes of this exercise, in your opinion?
Okay. We had in the past a rather large selections of exhibition by non-Western artists, and including, you know, people that from Africa and Asia, but mostly from Africa. And recently we had, even if she's completely Western, because she was born in France and raised, and then she lives in London. But we had an exhibition of Zineb Sedira, who is from Algerian descent, wonderful video / photographic artist who will be in fact representing France at the next Venice Biennale in 2021 or 2022. I don't know, 2021.
It's been moved by a year.
Sorry?
It's been moved by a year to 22 right now.
Yeah, 20, yeah. So that was one of the exercise that we did, and that's always, you know, that we welcome, and we did some others. Having said this, you know, we're not thinking of terms of quotas, you know, of saying, but of course we're open to all different aspects, and that worked with Zineb Sedira was really interesting, because she of course wanted to address some issues that were dealing with the colonial past of France and Algeria, and in fact we had then also with the very recent history of Algeria, and we had two rather strongly political pieces, especially one that was about the Islamist crisis in Algeria in the 90s with the FIS, Front Islamique de Salut, and the other was around that Pan-African dream of Algeria in the late 60s and early 70s, and where that has led Algeria since then. So there were two strongly political pieces that were included in the show, and a lot of the exhibition at Jeu de Paume in the past, let's say, in the past 10 years have been quite political. You know, we did something that was called Soulèvement, Upheavals, that was curated by Georges Didier Huberman, a great French art historian and philosopher, who was in fact about art and rebellion. And that was also very important, and that traveled a lot to different places outside France, which is always also a very interesting exercise to do. I don't know if I answered the question, but I did try to.
I think it was good. So there is a comment and a question from Shaunok Mahbubani. So Shaunok's comment, thinking on a previous thread, is thinking about the idea of representation in collections / exhibitions, and thinking through the urgency of the looming climate crisis, I feel it becomes even more pertinent to focus on ecologically centered works coming out of the global south. We already see with the increase in calamities that some specific regions of the south will be impacted in much greater extent than the north. Institutions can really play an important role to hold, highlight, and archive the experiences and knowledges that come from these regions through the voices of artists from these regions, the global south. And so that was Shaunok's comment, and his
maybe I would like to comment on that, because I think that there's an interesting dilemma that some institution, and most of the institution curators from the Western Hemisphere today have to deal with or have to address, is first their desire to have more globalized shows, and the fact that it often goes against environmental issues. You know, when you have works coming from 15,000 kilometers on airplanes, it goes against the environment. So there's a real, you know, I think that will be in fact one of the discussions and debates in the years to come. You know, how to not being local, because we definitely don't want to be local. We definitely want to be open to the world, and we should be open to the world. And I definitely don't want the Jeu de Paume to become just a museum or a gallery for French / European artists and photographers, but how to be global and yet to be to follow the environmental guidelines. So this is a tricky path that we have to find, and that will probably take a few years to be put in place. But it's true that more and more we are talking, when we are thinking about exhibition displays and about loans, etc. we're also talking about environment and about environmental issues. And we're trying, for example, in terms of exhibition layout, we are trying to have less and less layouts and less, walls to build, etc., than we used to. We try to recycle and reuse, but the main issue is how this work will travel in the future and how we can, make sure that we don't go against these environmental issues. That probably means having exhibitions that will be in place longer, that will have to works that will come to Europe, but that will stay in Europe and probably travel to other places at the same time. So there are new rules and new ways to find to be able to have both the opening to the world that we still want to have and the respect of new environmental norms.
I think in terms of photography, coming back to the idea of photography, there is the fact that a lot of photography can be, at least in today's world, is already produced in a digital way. And can kind of lend itself easily to a digital perspective, a digital platform. So that's the next question from Shaunak as well. So we'll see what your thoughts are on that. Considering the strong uptick in online shows during this pandemic, and considering that photography as a medium can easily take to the screen, what do you feel are some of the exciting innovations in showing lens-based works virtually? And maybe from the Jeu de Paume archive of online shows or from elsewhere?
Well, I would say that photography has always taken very different forms and will probably tend to be even more multifaceted in the future, but things are, of course, changing rapidly. But photography is an ubiquitous medium, and it has always been. So it's like it's not new, it's just taking new forms, but that ubiquitous or ubiquity of photography is something that we have always had to deal with, and that we have always had to adapt to face, from magazines to books to prints on the walls, today to screens, etc., laptops, mobile phones, etc., etc. So the museum will have, or the gallery, or the space will have to be in the future more and more, I would say, alert to and aware of all these different forms of photography. But I think you have different space. What I mean by that is that we are very conscious that our internet, our website needs to become a real digital museum. That is something that will commission and produce works that are meant to be seen online and only online, and that you will have works that will be also meant to be seen physically and only physically. And works that are meant to be seen online are not always, it's always good to translate them in physical terms into the physical space of the museum. So these are different channels that we'll have to work with in the future, and that we already started working with, because as I was saying, we have these commissions of virtual works that has been now ongoing for the last almost 10 years. So we were in fact quite ahead in that field, and we will of course continue doing so. But one of our tasks today is really I have the feeling that our website is a little outmoded, and so we're really working on turning it into a real digital space, digital museum, with the content of the magazine online, with the commissions of the new virtual, and also with all our archival material that we have, symposium, lectures, etc. And that's really that we are digitizing, and that we really want to re-put in the loop, and to revive, and to make accessible to a new audience. So that's something that we're working on, and I hope that when we reopen the physical museum in 2021, we reopen with a website that will be a real extension, a real virtual extension of the physical museum.
Yeah, I think what was also great was that some of the galleries were sharing work by. So I remember John Akomfra's gallery and then Shirin Neshad's gallery. They started showing their video works online. So I think streaming them for a couple of days, and I think that just opened up more than photography in terms of video works. I think it just was a great time to really see a lot of good. I mean, that for me was quite nice. So some more questions. There is an anonymous question. Can you briefly share about your beginnings and experience with curation, the transition from art history to curating for art fairs, museums?
So I come from, I would say, a non-artistic background. You know, I started, in fact, I studied politics and economy in Paris in a school which is called Institut d'études politiques, Sciences Po. And then I started working in what I would call the communication business in Paris for a few years. But soon enough, I realized that I had to earn my living doing something that I really was interested in, and I was really interested in art. So we have in France, as you know, France is a very centralized system, and we have in France something which not that many countries have, which is a school for curators called the Institut National du Patrimoine, National Heritage Institute. So that's a very formal French centralized system. So I passed the exam. I spent 2 years at the Institut National du Patrimoine. I was at that time interested in 20th century photography and art. In fact, my first interest in photography was in non-artistic forms of photography. I think my first real interest in a photograph was in late 19th century scientific imagery. You know, things by Etienne Jules Marais, Muybridge, astronomical photographs of the late 19th century. So we were quite far from art at that time, but it's through that, especially through these pre-cinematographic forms of photography, Etienne Jules Marais, Edward Muybridge, that I came to photography, and that I started getting interested in photography. But when I started at the Musée d'Orsay, as Arko was mentioning, in the early 90s, in a way I was not at all a specialist of photography. I was interested in photography. I knew a few things about photography. But when I arrived at the Musée d'Orsay, I trained myself by opening the boxes in the collection, you know, and that's, I would say, the perfect and probably the best training, especially when the collection is as stunning and extraordinary as the collection of the Musée d'Orsay. So discovering images, discovering objects, looking at them, having that kind of very direct and physical relationship with the image, that was for me an object. And that's also what the museum is about, you know, images that are objects and that have a physical presence. So that's how I became first a specialist of 19th century photography, and then I moved to 20th century and contemporary photography through the Centre Pompidou and MoMA. But 19th century has always been very important for me, and still remains. So in a way, in France, I'm of that last generation of people that were not trained in photography at the university, because, you know, at my generation, I was born in '65. So when I studied at the university in the early 80s, there were very few, and when I say very few, there were no courses specialized in photography or video, of course, or very few there were some in films, but not that many. So yeah, I'm probably one of the last generation, because I would say in France, from the late 80s, early 90s, you see some photography classes arriving at the university, and now you have, of course, a younger generation of curators that went through that had photography classes and courses at the university. But so I'm the last one of that last generation.
Yeah. There is a question from Shruti Mukherjee. She says, firstly, she thanks Jeu de Paume for being an inspiration throughout her graduation days in Paris. She had the opportunity to see the works of Sally Mann, Peter Hujar, Zineb Sideira, and the supermarket of images.
Mhm.
However, she graduated in the wrong year as an emerging photographer, as it is extremely hard to find work due to the pandemic. So she's wondering if is Jeu de Paume going to bring in any programs for emerging artists, or are there any suggestions?
Well, in fact, we already starting so by we associated ourselves with the Centre National des Arts Plastiques (CNAP), which is one of the national collections in France, and we decided to co-commission works to a young artist. That would be really virtual works. This is a commission that, in fact, we launched. We already selected 16, in fact, artists that are supposed to work in the next month to produce works that are meant to be mostly seen online in a kind of dematerialized way. And that we will try to show one way or another, still to be determined, either on the website or in the physical space of the Jeu de Paume, or both, in 2021, at one point in 2021. So that was a commission that we really wanted, and that we opened just after, or just in fact during the lockdown, early May, to support younger artists that didn't have, of course, access to galleries at that time. So it's only, of course, supporting 16 artists, but that's a start. And I hope also that we can do something with the Ministère de la Culture and do a larger commission that would be about, France and Europe after lockdown, and how this has affected our way of living, and maybe our way of photographing. But that's still under discussion.
There is an anonymous question which goes like this: does working with the mandate of different institutions or museums interfere with the curatorial process? How have you navigated the vision of the institution and the hard conversations that must be had via art and photography? Can you comment on, within quotes, the curator becoming institutionalized in that sense?
Well, I would say it's true that I worked with mostly in big institutions that had a photography department, among other departments, that were completely multidisciplinary institution with painting, sculpture, architecture, design, film, etc. That was the case at the Musée d'Orsay. That was the case at the Pompidou, and of course at MoMA. And what I was always interested in doing is to have that dialogue between the departments, to try to open up the department, to try to make obvious the fact that photography is everywhere, that photography has been practiced by all artists far beyond the small circle of photographers, but by architects, by sculptors, and that has been, of course, that has had, needless to say, a main influence on the way art evolved in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that is still very, very influential. So I was always very interested in that, in this possibility of dialogues between the departments, and this is something that I've always tried to do, and I think that I did achieve quite well, especially at MoMA. I left MoMA last year, but I worked on the reopening and the rehang of their collection with the new wing that opened at MoMA 6 months ago. And what we tried to achieve at that time was really to break the boundaries between the departments, to try to get rid of that silo culture that MoMA had for more than 40 years, with each department working on its own, and to have a fully integrated display of the collection, which is something I think that we achieved quite well, and which is a real rupture in a way vis-a-vis the traditional way that MoMA had separated the gallery, one for photography, one from painting, one for design, etc., etc. So that fully integrated display is something quite new, and something that I've always tried to do at MoMA, but also at the Pompidou and also at Orsay, to have this kind of dialogues. So I don't know if, once again, if I'm answering a question. I'm trying to answer the question, but there was another aspect to the question, I think.
I think we are also very, we are headed towards the end of time, but I mean, you can finish. Yeah.
And another important thing is that when you're, what was interesting, I was at the head of the photo department at the Pompidou and at MoMA, so at two big institutions that were both dealing with 20th and early 21st century art, but that had very different collections. And so when you start working in an institution, and especially heading a department, you need, of course, to enter that institution, to stay yourself, but also to take into account all the history of that institution and especially of the collection. So what I mean by that is I did not collect the same way at the Pompidou than I did at MoMA. I sometimes collected the same artists, but not always with the same works, because in fact the collections were very different. So it's always try to find that balance to, of course, take into account the history of the collection and the history of the institution, and yet to try to remain yourself, to stay yourself.
We are very much at the end of our thing. So at the end of our conversation, it was, I think just before ending, I wanted to just hear a couple of words from you on what you would what thoughts you would have for someone who is trying to be a curator in photography, in the visual arts. What thoughts would you have? What guidance would you have for someone who is starting out?
I would say work hard. Don't hesitate to look at many different things. Don't stick to the art world. There are many interesting images outside the art world, and what especially photography is fascinating about is the fact that it's not only an art form but also a cultural artifact, an anthropological fact, and that all these kind of images are also interesting, and that of course have had a lot of impact on the artistic practice. So I would say, stay open to non-artistic forms, to popular forms of photography, and stay alert to new techniques and new media with no preconceived ideas, no hierarchy. Everything goes, as William Klein says.
I think that's a lovely note to end our beautiful discursive journey today. It's been amazing talking with you. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to hear your thoughts on curation and on the institution that you're at, Jeu de Paume, which is an amazing place. For whoever's not been there, strongly urge you to go there when it's back in full form. With that, I think we come to the end of our program. Thank you so much to Institut Français and Chennai Photo Biennale for organizing this, and thank you so much once again to Kanta for being with us today. So
thank you for the invitation, and stay all safe in Chennai.
Yeah, thank you so much to.
You're not in Chennai, but
I'm stuck in France. So, but thank you so much to everyone, to all the attendees. Thank you for being with us. Yeah.
Bye bye.
We end with that. Yeah.
And